Well, thank you very much, Tamas, for your introduction. And thank you to the network for inviting me to give this keynote on what I think is one of the most difficult subjects that we have to deal with in trying to remember the past, particularly remembering the Second World War and its consequences. I'm almost conscious, this is the second time I've given a keynote for this network, but it's a rather strange thing to ask somebody from England to do this. England is a country which did not experience dictatorship in the 20th century, did not experience genocide, where the idea of perpetrator, victim, bystander is much less developed for obvious reasons. And I suppose my one claim might be that coming from England, it's possible to view these questions with greater neutrality, perhaps, than in other parts of Europe. Well, my keynote is going to focus, I think, on the theme of the conference, which is not quite, I think, what Tamas addressed, which is really about how to speak about the impact of these two dictatorships without equalizing their crimes. And that is a difficult issue, I think, to confront. And we've heard quite a lot already about the ambiguity of responding both to Nazi crimes on the one hand and Soviet crimes on the other. Now, over the past 20 years, there's been a radical change in the way in which the major totalitarian regimes involved in World War II have been remembered and recorded. Before then, there was a clear separation in the public mind, and certainly in the Western world, between the criminal nature of the German wars and the Soviet Union's just war of defense against invasion. Now, that difference, of course, lay in the outcome of the conflict. National Socialist Germany was a defeated state. Its leaders were put on trial for a range of crimes. The Soviet Union was one of the victorious allies and was able for years to deny any accusation that some of its pre-war and wartime actions resembled the crimes of which National Socialist leaders were accused. Aggressive war against Finland, Poland, harsh occupation policies, the murder of prisoners of war, and so on. The opening up of the former Soviet archives to historical scrutiny, as well as the collapse of the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, has made it possible since the 1990s to talk more openly and honestly about the nature of the Soviet dictatorship and its wartime behavior. The results of these changed perspectives on the Soviet Union during the 1940s has been to encourage some kind of equivalence between the criminal characteristics of totalitarian regimes, however they are defined. The publication in France of the Black Book of Communism in 1997 was a milestone in the rejection of the idea that the Soviet Union had been a progressive force in the Stalin years, in contrast to the reactionary racism and crude imperialism of Hitler's Reich. Since then, there has been a plethora of publications highlighting the atrocious nature of the Soviet dictatorship. In Poland, for example, it has been demonstrated by historians that the difference between German occupation and Soviet occupation between 1939 and 1941 were differences simply of degree. Both sides characterized by deportations, the seizure of property, anti-Semitism, the suppression of a national elite, and police terror. A Polish historian has argued that German terror was harsher and less pragmatic than Soviet terror. But for the victims, this is a largely academic distinction. Now, there are obvious commonalities between the two dictatorships in the period of World War. Some commentators have tried to count the number of dead under the two systems to see which of the dictators, Hitler or Stalin, was the more murderous. Well, this is scarcely a useful exercise in my view, since it explains nothing, even if it acknowledges how murderous the two regimes were. The irony of the long argument about the murders at Katyn is that either side could have done it, even if in this case Soviet responsibility is now beyond doubt. Nevertheless, there are obvious common features in the way the two dictatorships worked and the impact the dictatorships had on the area described by Timothy Snyder as the Bloodlands, the swathe of territory between Germans and Russians in Eastern Europe. Each dictatorship set up its own moral standard to achieve a distant utopia. The moral imperative of the German dictatorship was a biological one: preservation of the German race at the expense of all others. The moral imperative of the Soviet system was sociological, the construction of a social system that was supposed to privilege workers, poor peasants, and party intellectuals. Those who were included in the system were relatively safe, and I mean relatively, protected by what Vladimir Tizmiano has called the delusional vision of mandatory happiness. But in reality, these were dangerous and vengeful systems, even for those included in the community. Indeed, the commonest feature of the two systems was the desire to control absolutely the cultural expression, political outlook, and personal values of the populations under their rule. For those who tested the limits of this control, or who were the wrong class or the wrong race, there was a spectacularly cruel system of concentration camps, police terror, censorship, and discrimination. Historians now talk of entanglements when they explain relations between different systems or countries. And it is not difficult to argue that these two systems certainly learnt something from each other. Yet in important ways, the totalitarian regimes were different, equivalent in practice, but historically distinct. They were shaped by unique historical circumstances and experiences. The German dictatorship was the product of a society profoundly affected by resentment at German treatment in 1919 and desperate to revive German economic and international fortunes. Most Germans did not realize that the end product of support for Hitlerism would be imperial war and genocide, but that was indeed the outcome. By the late 1930s, Hitler hoped that he could construct his new Europe by waging a short imperial war. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was the product of the crisis in Russia at the end of World War I, and I think more significantly, of the lengthy and destructive civil war that followed. The consolidation of the Soviet regime and the desire to export Moscow's version of communism produced not a short imperial war, but a long Cold War with the Western world from the 1920s through to the 1980s, in the course of which German aggression opened the way to a form of Soviet empire in Eastern Europe. These differing experiences affect the way the two dictatorships are remembered and make a simplistic equivalence unhelpful if sense is to be made of the particular forms of atrocity or political oppression associated with the two systems. To brand the two as totalitarian, and it should not be forgotten that this is a term first coined, of course, in Mussolini's Italy, a dictatorship we generally tend to ignore when we're talking about the impact of totalitarian dictatorships. To brand the two as totalitarian covers over the historical contrasts and makes explanation both too easy and too vague. The important issue in remembering the two dictatorships is the historical perspective of the particular communities that recall them. There is no constant or common memory, though I think we often like to think there should be. There is no constant or common memory, but a variety of perspectives that have changed over time as historical circumstances have changed, and as a fuller historical understanding has emerged. The Western memory, for example, of the two dictatorships has been coloured by a complete rejection of the totalitarian model, whether National Socialist or Soviet. But for a long time, there was always greater sympathy for the Soviet experience in the West, which was seen as progressive, though flawed, while the Hitler dictatorship was always viewed, and by many people still is, as an expression of ultimate human evil. Recent writing on the Soviet Union, however, and I mean recent, the last 20 years, has been coloured by a powerful Western tradition of hostility towards communism, particularly Soviet communism, whose evil now appears to be as explicit as that of the Third Reich. The German memory of the two dictatorships is, by contrast, profoundly ambivalent. On the one hand, there is widespread public recognition of the criminal nature of the Hitler regime and of those who actively profited from it. On the other, there is the problem that Germans can be seen as victims too, not only of the dictatorship, their own dictatorship, but of the bombing and the post-war expulsions. The idea of German victimhood suggests a moral equivalence between the combatant powers. Among other things, Allied bombing and the mass rapes perpetrated by the Red Army can be used to make German responsibility for crime seem more ambiguous, even reactive. Moreover, the division of Germany in 1949 allowed Germans then and now to contrast the Federal Republic, a model of Western liberal capitalism, with communist oppression in the Democratic Republic, whose totalitarian practices meant that a fraction of the German population was hostage to dictatorial oppression for almost 60 years. In the DDR, National Socialist dictatorship elided easily into Soviet dictatorship, making it possible since 1990 to elide the memory of both systems as equally oppressive. There is a similar ambiguity, and we heard about this yesterday from the President. There is a similar ambiguity in Austrian memory of the dictatorship, depending on whether Austria is regarded as liberated from German rule or complicit with the aims of the dictatorship, or indeed both. The perspective from those areas which suffered double occupation, first as a product of German imperialism, then as a consequence of Soviet victory in World War II, is self-evidently distinct from memory in the rest of Europe, because here the peoples of the region experienced at first hand and for years the domination of one oppressive system after another. The idea that the so-called people's democracies, or the regions forced under direct Soviet rule, were the beneficiaries of liberation in 1944-45 has a hollow ring to it. But that was the official position, expressed in official histories and public memory, until the collapse of the entire order in 1989-90. Only now can the memory of a long period of national extinction or political oppression be confronted with greater historical honesty and openness. Here too, little is served by simply condemning Axis or Soviet domination as varieties of the same impulse to control and terrorize in the name of utopian fantasies about the future, as if the differing historical experiences over this long period were equivalent. To borrow Jay Winter's phrase, There are at least 3 different sites of memory that one can identify for this region. The first involves the sacrifices imposed on Eastern and Southeastern Europe, from the Baltic states in the north to Greece in the south, through the construction of the Axis New Order. This involved a combination of national extinction, genocidal strategies of ethnic cleansing, economic spoliation, and the suppression of all political and cultural institutions that did not serve the interests of the imperial power, essentially a colonial relationship. It was characterized by the claim made by the head of the RSHA, Reinhard Heydrich, that the peoples of the occupied areas would become helots, slaves for their German masters. In this sense, German domination resembled in important respects the pattern of European imperialism practiced since the 19th century by other European states and during the Second World War, particularly by Italy. The second site of memory concerns the impact of the Soviet invasion and occupation of the region as the Red Army destroyed the brief exercise of German imperial rule. This experience was itself divided between the immediate occupation and the establishment of regimes sympathetic to Moscow, with the exception of Yugoslavia, between 1945 and 1948, and the subsequent development of the people's democracies over time. In the case of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and what is now Moldova, Soviet domination meant national extinction, but not a complete loss of their specific identity under the federal nature of the Soviet state. Elsewhere, national sovereignty of a kind was restored, economic growth was stimulated through a series of planned economic developments, and official culture allowed to flourish. Freedom of expression and individual liberty were not respected. Secret police forces lurked behind the facade of public unity. But the system was not the same as the violent, exploitative, and genocidal empire established during the war by the Axis states. This does not make communist domination any easier to accept as an historical legacy or indeed to experience. But memory of the Soviet era is not the equivalent of memory of the German-dominated occupation. The third site of memory is different again. And here there is an obvious common link between recollection of life under the 2 dictatorships. The common thread is popular resistance to dictatorship, whether German or Soviet. There was resistance, of course, in Italy after 1943 and in France, the Low Countries and Norway, but all of this was in the expectation and realization of liberation by Western armies. In Eastern Europe, resistance began under German domination in present-day Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, and continued in some cases on to the early 1950s against the imposition or reimposition of communist rule. Resistance in its active armed form was cruelly treated by both dictatorships. Whether the fate of Warsaw after the rising in August 1944, or the fate of Ukrainian nationalists fighting against both dictatorships for the ideal of a national Ukrainian state. Perhaps 250,000 died in Warsaw as a result of the rising. And according to the historian Alexander Statyev, an estimated 133,000 were killed in the anti-Soviet insurgencies between 1944 and 1946. How many died resisting in the crossfire between the 2 systems during the war will never be known with any certainty. The difference between resistance here and resistance in Western and Southern Europe is that it failed to overturn either system and was extinguished with a harsh brutality by both the dictatorships. In this sense, there is equivalence in remembering those who struggled against both totalitarian systems as forerunners of the eventual movement to liberate the former communist bloc from communist authoritarianism. Memory, even here, can be problematic, since in some cases the earlier insurgents were hardly models of tolerant democratic values. When talking about the memory of the totalitarian regimes, it is necessary to disaggregate the different elements of memory and the differing historical circumstances that have shaped them. It is also necessary to recognize that within each area of memory culture, there remain awkward differences of view, as well as ambiguities in a historical record that embraces perpetrators as well as victims, collaborators along with resistors. There are nevertheless ways in which it is possible to move forward in remembering the experience of totalitarian rule and wartime atrocity, without necessarily imposing a crude equivalence on the crimes of the regimes involved. And I would suggest 3 ways in which we might do that. First, it is important to accept the need for honesty in confronting a difficult history. Of course, no historical writing is perfect, and history continues to change over time with changing perspectives and scholarly interests. But nothing is to be gained by denial or sophistry when dealing with the historical reality of the dictatorships. Historical honesty on all sides means acceptance of facts that fit uncomfortably with established traditions of memory or public history. But there seems little prospect of reconciling different memory cultures without confronting directly those issues that continue to define acts of remembrance as contested sites of memory. Secondly, it is unhelpful to ignore the differing historical circumstances that shape the actions of the dictatorships and shape the way that individuals responded to them. A proper historicization of the wartime period and the role of the dictatorial regimes is an essential foundation for moving on to understand what prompted and sustained the often atrocious behavior of the regimes towards those brought involuntarily under their rule or domination. Terror does not equal terror, any more than concentration camp, labor camp, or extermination camp are identical phenomena. A proper historical understanding of the nature of the different totalitarian regimes and the purposes of their terror system and the categories of victims is the precondition for understanding why the regimes acted as they did, and why the population under their control adopted a variety of responses in order to survive, but seldom confronted the regimes head-on. Memory is not the same as history. Indeed, will often deny that history or distort or mythologize it because of a psychological or social function that collective memory performs. But memory of these experiences will in the end be served better by a fuller historical understanding than by embedded prejudices and preferences in interpreting the past. Finally, there is one sense, I think, in which memory of these regimes prompts a moral equivalence. At the heart of a dilemma posed by remembrance is the argument about who is remembered and who is remembering. Yet the history of the German and Soviet totalitarian systems, and not forgetting, as I said, the Italian dictatorship, which flourished alongside during the war, the history of the German and Soviet totalitarian systems highlights the need to endorse the principles of this European network, that remembrance serves the purpose of a common humanity, which transcends the historical distinctions of the regimes, in order to assert our contemporary commitment to protect the individual's freedom of expression and freedom to choose, from the resurrection or renewal of any totalitarian menace. Thank you very much.